Okay, we can get started here. Just have a few folks still hopefully squeezing in their seats, particularly on the right side as you face the stage, up toward the front, a few more seats. But welcome to New America. I am Michael Calabrese. I direct the Wireless Future Project, which is part of New America's Open Technology Institute. And this is harnessing satellite spectrum for broadband. Will incumbents sell, stay, or share? Next week, as probably most of you know and why you're here, next week we expect the FCC to release a draft proposal to open this large band of satellite spectrum, the C-band, for mobile and fixed wireless broadband. The C-band is what's suddenly, really just in the past few years, become very valuable mid-band spectrum. It's 500 megahertz. This is the downlink portion of the band. In other words, where as you'll see in the presentations, where the earth stations, the dishes receive mostly video distribution, but radio feeds, Associated Press uses it, and so on, from 3,700 to 4,200, which puts it also just immediately above and adjacent to the new Citizens broadband radio service, which is the final details of that are being worked out this year for implementation, hopefully early next year. And that will be the band that's been open to share with U.S. Navy radar. The C-band currently carries live TV and radio programming from content producers to local stations and cable systems nationwide. More than 110 million American households rely for TV on thousands of earth stations to distribute content via cable system head-ends, local broadcast stations, and even over-the-top video providers are increasingly using it. So making use of C-band for broadband, because right now it's pretty much only for video distribution and a handful of fixed links, making use of it for terrestrial broadband will require reconciling the interests of a half dozen or more powerful industries, most of which have at least one representative here in this event. So today we'll hear about the two proposals, the two leading and potentially complementary proposals that are likely to be substantially teed up in the NPRM. One would authorize market deals, essentially a private auction, to clear satellite video distribution off at least a lower portion of the band. And how much of the band is something we'll talk about today. The other proposal would authorize shared use of the unused frequencies in the remainder of the band for high-capacity fixed wireless service, which would be mostly in rural and less densely populated areas. So this would be something that would share the available capacity in the ongoing portion of the fixed satellite service band, regardless of how much is cleared at the bottom of the band. So our format is that we'll actually hear a presentation on each of these leading proposals. First from Andy Clegg of Google and Haz Mowaket from Intelsat. And they'll make those presentations. We're giving them kind of more time. They'll answer a couple questions. And then we'll bring our panel up, a whole different group of folks that represents some of the other perspectives involved in this. I hope you all will be thinking about your comments and questions. We'll open it up again at the end of the panel for that, and at that point let us know who you are. Hopefully you picked up biographies, just bio briefs on the speakers as you came in. That way, that will allow us to shorten introductions considerably. So to get the show on the road, I will introduce Andy Clegg, who is the Spectrum Engineering Lead at Google LLC. Andy also plays a leading role in coordinating the multi-stakeholder process that is developing the technical rules for implementation of a citizen band radio service, I think, which gives him a lot of particular insight into this, and was formerly U.S. National Science Foundation. So, Andy?
All right, thanks, Michael. Thanks for having us here, and your introductory remarks pretty much said almost everything I was going to say, so I guess I'm done, and we can pass it to Haas. All right, thanks, everybody. So let's see, Mike, how do I get my slides up? Michael, how do I get the slides up? They are not. We will find out. There they are now. Perfect. Got it. Got it. Yep. 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 Got it. Okay, so thanks. I'm going to give just a little bit of background on C-band, sort of along the lines of what Michael already said, but maybe with a little bit more technical detail, so you understand some of the issues having to do with sharing of C-band. I'm also going to say a few words of why this is suddenly in the news, why are we hearing everything about C-band all of a sudden, and why we think it could be used for fixed broadband or mobile broadband or other applications beyond what it's being used for right now. And I'm going to do all of that in 15 minutes, so it might go a little bit fast. Let's see. Yes, so your clicker is not working. That is the situation. Is it wireless and you're not, yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm being jammed by wireless. All right, we're going to have to do it from here. You want to try it?
Thank you. There you go.
All right. Excellent, very good. All right, there we go. So we have it moving. So if I can't even figure out a clicker, I'm not sure if I'll be able to figure out C-band. Yeah, okay, all right, there go the engineering credentials, right. So as Michael already mentioned, C-band is range of frequencies, 3,700 to 4,200 megahertz in the spectrum. The key there is that it's actually quite a bit of spectrum. It's 500 megahertz of contiguous spectrum altogether, which is a lot. It's, to put that in perspective, 500 megahertz of spectrum is 10 times the amount of spectrum we currently have for licensed fixed broadband in the lower bands. And it's also more than just about all of the other mobile broadband spectrum combined. So if you took cellular and PCS and AWS in the 600 megahertz band and the 700 megahertz band, all of that for mobile broadband, and you added all of that bandwidth together, it wouldn't equal the amount of bandwidth in C-band. So it's a lot of spectrum, very valuable. The reason that a lot of spectrum is valuable is the more spectrum you have, the more throughput you can get out of it. If you could use all 500 megahertz for broadband, you could conceivably get a gross throughput of about 2 gigabits a second of data through that 500 megahertz. Now, of course, you have to share that 2 gigabits, but the point is that it could rival consumer fiber optic delivery to the home or businesses if you could have access to up to 500 megahertz of spectrum. I've put a little cutout of the NTIA spectrum chart down there at the bottom. As you can see, most of the services by frequency are carved up into tiny little slivers of spectrum space, but C-band that's circled in the red is actually one of the largest blocks along that region of spectrum. So it gives you an idea that it's a considerable amount of spectrum. It would be great to put it to more intensive use than it's currently being used for. So what is it currently being used for? Today it's being used, as Michael said, for predominantly satellite downlinks. So geostationary satellites that are staying what appear to be stationary over the Earth downlink their signals to C-band dishes. And those dishes receive the signal and then move it off into other areas. And as Michael said, it's used for a variety of important things like programming, video programming, audio programming. So cable TV stations get their programming over C-band, local TV stations get their programming over C-band. Live events, NASCAR, golf, all that, football, all of that may use C-band for distributing video and other content. You get news, and then it's also useful for international programming. An important distinction here, a little bit of confusion. In the US, C-band is not used for direct-to-consumer video services. In some areas, particularly in Latin America, it is. In the US, it is not. Almost all of the content on C-band is encrypted, so nobody has a C-band dish in their backyard anymore receiving transmissions directly from satellites. It's all commercial services. Haas is shaking his head, so soon he'll correct me, but I actually know that he's wrong, so just listen to me, not to Haas. So there are a few hobbyists, ham radio operators, things like that are into finding those few unencrypted channels that are still there. And I'll tell you what's on those unencrypted channels is not particularly fascinating. But so Haas is technically correct, but practically I'm correct. Okay, so so just to give you an idea of where the actual registered, if you go to the FCC database, you can operators of the C-band dishes can register their dish location. And if you go to the FCC database, you download the data. You get a plot that looks like this. Depending on how you count them, there's several thousand C-band earth stations registered in the FCC's database. They're distributed pretty much following the population of the United States. So there's quite a few of them out there, no doubt about it. Quite a few of them out there, but we think there's ways to work around them. So some of the characteristics that are important to understanding how we could share C-band. The dishes are, as mentioned, but it's important to understand, the dishes are receive only in 3700 to 4200 megahertz. They don't transmit. So the issue of sharing the band is not coordinating your broadband system being interfered with by the satellite dishes. It is your broadband system interfering with the satellite dishes. It's not the other way around. It's an important thing to remember. The dishes are receiving signals from geostationary satellites that are more than 35,000 kilometers away. So by the time the signal gets all the way to the dish, it's very weak. And so the dishes are very susceptible to interference. So it's another consideration when you try to put a broadband system in the band. You've got to mitigate interference to the dish. However, there are some mitigating factors about how the dishes operate. First, by virtue of them being large, their beam is tightly focused and it's looking up in the sky. So they're trying to get signals from the satellite. They're not trying to get signals from the surrounding area on the horizon. So there's a little bit of natural immunity to interference coming from the horizon. It's not immune, but it does impact. The main gain of the antenna is up into space, not around the ground and the terrestrial areas. So important thing to consider that, there are mitigating factors. They are very susceptible to interference, but there are mitigating factors that help us coordinate with these dishes. And another important thing is we know exactly where the dishes are. They're registered. We have the latitude, the longitude. We know exactly where they are. We can try to work around them based on our broadband network design. So why the recent interest in C-band? Really, all of the interest comes from the first point here, and that is the continued rise in the demand for wireless broadband. Wireless broadband growth demand continues at double-digit rates, both fixed broadband and mobile broadband. So we as consumers continue to desire to have more and more wireless broadband. There's limited amount of spectrum available. Most of the easy, low-hanging fruit spectrum has already been taken for broadband, and so to get more, we have to start looking at how we can share with other services, and so that's where we are with C-band. The characteristics of this band are fairly desirable. It's kind of not too high in frequency, so things propagate fairly well, but it's not too low in frequency where they propagate too well and interfere with other things, so it's kind of it's what we call, it's the very low end of what's now called mid-band spectrum. That's the trendy term that was invented out of nowhere. But it's the very lowest end of mid-band spectrum. It's adjacent to the new Citizens Broadband Radio Service, CBRS, so there is a little bit of interplay with the equipment that's being developed for CBRS, or potential interplay. It's also adjacent to a band that used to be used for point-to-multipoint to provide rural wireless services, broadband services. It partially overlaps an international standard LTE band, so there's interest when you talk about global harmonization, of potential harmonization with part of the C-band spectrum. We've done a lot of work on automated systems to basically pre-coordinate use of the spectrum, and we could apply some of those systems or the basics of some of those systems to this band. And then there's been a couple of petitions filed lately by the Broadband Access Coalition, represented by some of the speakers here, and also by Intelsat and Intel, about how to use the spectrum in a more intensive manner, and that has led to FCC proceeding on it. And so all of these factors together, and this is why C-band is suddenly in the news today. So can satellite services and broadband share the C-band? That's the key question that we're dealing here. And there's really two ways to look at it. There's two use models that are at play here. The two different proposals have essentially two different use cases. One use case is, could you deploy fixed point-to-multipoint services in the band? So let's say you have a central tower and you have homes in a rural area beaming back to that tower. That's the point-to-multipoint case. So that's very similar to the way rural broadband is provided today, but it's provided typically in unlicensed spectrum or in small amounts of spectrum in another band. If you used all 500 megahertz of C-band or some portion of it, you could get much better rural broadband service. So that's the point-to-multipoint model. The other model is the mobile use case, and that is what, more traditionally, like your cell phone, you move around, there are base stations, they transmit in all directions, and no matter where you are, you can get a signal and you can communicate back to the base station. That's the mobile use case. So how do those two cases compare when it goes to protecting FSS from interference? In the fixed point-to-multipoint case, we believe it's very simple to protect fixed satellite services operating in the band. You simply engineer your system so that you're never pointing at a fixed satellite service dish, and you won't interfere with them. Now, there's a lot more to it than just that, but that's the basic concept. You point your antennas in a direction where you're not going. You engineer your system so that you deploy it so that you can point your antennas in areas that are not going to interfere with the fixed satellite service dishes. The mobile case, on the other hand, the whole purpose of mobile is you want to be able to use your phone no matter where you are. So mobile base stations radiate in all directions or in very wide swaths of directions, and they enable people to move around with mobile phones and connect to the base station. So it's very difficult to coordinate mobile use with omnidirectional antennas from interfering with the satellite service. So we believe the fixed use case, we can operate co-channel, same frequency with FSS if we engineer our systems carefully. And for the mobile case, we don't think you can operate co-channel with FSS. And I think this is one point Haas will agree on. I'm not sure. We'll find out in a few minutes when he comes up here and says that I'm all wrong. So again, just sort of reiterating the mobile scenario, the mobile base station is the black dot in the middle of this orange circle. The orange circle is the radiation coming out of the base station. And as you can see, because that radiation goes in all directions, it overlays some of the fixed satellite service Earth stations and potentially interferes with them. But even more importantly, the mobiles talking back to the base station, they're not constrained where they can go. They can go anywhere in that service area, and they may find themselves very close to an Earth station and causing interference. So it's first the omnidirectional and the uncontrolled nature of the mobile service that makes it very difficult to share with FSS, fixed satellite service Earth stations. The point-to-multipoint scenario is very different. You engineer your system such that your base station, again, the black dot in the middle of the figure, beams its energy towards the homes it's trying to serve. It doesn't beam its energy in any other direction. It just beams its energy directly at the homes that it wants to serve. And those homes beam their signal back to communicate with that base station, typically weaker signals that don't travel quite as far. And those also, from an interference perspective, don't overlap the FSS Earth stations. The Earth stations are located outside of the interference zones of both the customer equipment and the base station, and interference isn't an issue. So two exceedingly overly simplified examples of why you can do this with point-to-multipoint, but why you can't do this with mobile. But the fact is that these are the considerations that go into engineering systems, point-to-multipoint, that will not interfere with satellite. If you want more technical details, we have a filing that was filed in the 17-183 docket. Feel free to go look at the technical filing. If you're having trouble sleeping or whatever, go take a look at it. So coordinating, how exactly can we do this? As I said, it's easier to do this when you don't have very many FSS dishes that you have to avoid. Certainly it's true that the fewer dishes there are to avoid, the easier this is to do it. So you can look at the statistics of how many FSS dishes are in an area based upon the population of the area. I won't go through the details of the calculation, but over 100 million Americans have 20 or fewer FSS Earth stations within 20 kilometers or 100 kilometers of their location. So you would only have to work around 20 or fewer FSS Earth stations in order to make this point-to-multipoint scenario work for over 100 million Americans. Haas is shaking his head. This is very useful. He shakes his head, so I'm able to rebut him already, because before he even gets up, he's going to say there's lots of unregistered Earth stations. We hear that. We encourage the satellite industry to register those Earth stations so that we know where they are and we can do further assessments. So very good. And then from a distance perspective, not counting the unregistered Earth stations, about 10% of the U.S. population lives 30 kilometers or farther from the closest registered FSS Earth station. So 30 kilometers is a long way, gives you a lot of breathing room. You might be able to deploy without causing interference over such large distances. So it's a consideration. When the satellite industry registers all of their secret Earth stations, and we know where they all are, I might come in, you know, a few months from now and say, oh, I was all wrong. There's so many of them, we can't possibly do this. That's possible. That might happen. I kind of doubt it, but we're waiting to see what the outcome is. So to wrap up the shared use of the C-band, we see that, you know, potentially 100 million or more Americans, a lot of them in rural or less populated areas, could be served by point-to-multipoint broadband. We think if you want to use part of C-band for mobile broadband, you can't do it on the same frequencies that the satellite service uses. So you need to relocate the satellite services off of those frequencies so that you can use it for mobile broadband. But we think, you know, and Haas will talk a little bit more about this, we think there are models where you could enable moving part of the operations of C-band FSS out of certain frequencies and making room for mobile. And we don't dispute that that's, you know, that's a viable additional option to use for C-band. We think it's a win-win-win scenario. You could potentially utilize, you know, say 100 megahertz of C-band in densely populated urban areas where you need more mobile broadband capacity. You relocate FSS out of that 100 megahertz. You let them use that. You still have 400 megahertz left over where you could potentially do underlay services as described here in the point-to-multipoint model. But then off in the rural areas or the less densely populated areas, we think you could actually use all 500 megahertz. Perhaps the mobile broadband industry is not as interested in that 100 megahertz in rural areas. You could have access to all 500 megahertz. You could operate co-channel with the fixed satellite service with a point-to-multipoint system and not cause interference. The key of the point-to-multipoint case is we think you can do this without causing any interference or disruption at all to the FSS. They don't have to relocate. They don't have to re-engineer their systems. They can stay exactly where they are. We engineer around them. And even more importantly, you can do this immediately. We think you can do this with no preparation. We're ready to go. We have the equipment. We have the engineering. And we are totally ready to deploy this. So a quick summary of how we think you can do point-to-multipoint in the band and some considerations related to mobile. And now we'll let Haas come up and rebut everything else. Thank you guys very much.
Andy, are you staying? No, I mean just stay at the podium.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
And then you'll just sit back down there. But if are you going to stay to the end of the event? Okay. Yep. I mean, there's also a chance, you know, at the end when you're asking questions to the panel, if you want to ask a question at that point to Andy or Haas, you can do that. But if there's anyone who has any like quick question or two right now in terms of clarification. Or anything, you know, while we have Andy up here. I mean, one I have just really quickly is how long would it take to deploy a fixed wireless P2MP underlay? Because the whole mobile clearing process will clearly take a while. But
right.
What about to make use of this for rural broadband? Right.
So the equipment already exists. There's a lot of leverage with the equipment that's being developed for the adjacent band and CBRS. So the equipment basically already exists. A couple of tweaks to the equipment might be needed. We, as Google has filed, and I think the Broadband Access Coalition and others have also filed, there are some minor tweaks to the FCC rules that are required to implement this. Very minor tweaks because the band is already allocated to the fixed service. And those tweaks could be done very quickly. We think that a point-to-multipoint underlay could be done on the same time scale or maybe even faster than the satellite industry and Intel and others are claiming that they could do the transition for mobile broadband. So we think as fast or faster.
Okay. Yep. One back here, let us know who you are too. There's a microphone that'll come over to you.
Henry Hetker, researcher now. I wondered what percentage of the spectrum is the C-band? It looked like a very small percent of the total spectrum. Is there a problem sharing in the other part of the spectrum between the various types of signals?
Right, so the shortest answer to that is yes. There is, when you look at the spectrum as a whole, there's a lot of bands that have been studied for sharing. For a variety of technical and regulatory reasons, this is one of the best. A lot of those other bands are shared with, for example, federal government for operations that involve critical government systems, radars, and things that we're not necessarily allowed to know all of the details about. Some of the other bands are used for things like licenses that people have paid for at auction and things like that, and you can't, because by virtue of the fact they've paid a lot of money for it at auction, it's very important to point out the satellite industry paid zero for this spectrum, so others may have paid a lot of money for their spectrum, so it's not quite fair to try to share theirs without sort of doing a tighter coordination. So. And others are used for things like airplane radars that measure their altitude above the ground, things that are safety of life related, things like that. So as far as the study of all of the bands go, there are a variety of alternative bands, but this one appears to be one of the best for mobile broadband for a variety of reasons for sharing.
Okay,
cool.
Great.
All right, thanks a lot, Michael.
Thanks.
All right, thanks.
All right, next up is Haz Mawakit, the Vice President for Spectrum Strategy at Intelsat. Haz is a satellite industry veteran, and at Intelsat he is responsible for managing efforts that protect, optimize, and leverage the company's spectrum assets in support of the company's long-term growth strategy.
Thank you, Mike. So just to make sure that I have this. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you about this very important topic. It's a very important policy topic that affects us and affects the economic leadership of the U.S. and the competitiveness of the U.S. So thank you for giving me the opportunity. So I will start first by talking about just a simple question, an overarching question. Why are we here today? We all love 5G. We are all excited about 5G. And we are basically trying to accelerate the way to 5G in the U.S. too, so that the U.S. can maintain its leadership. And we would like to get the spectrum in the hands of 5G operators as fast as possible, while at the same time protecting the current users of the satellite, of the C-band, the satellite users of C-band, which are very important. This is plain and simple. This is what we are here for. So, for those of you who are not familiar with Intelsat, Intelsat is over 50 years old. We have been providing satellite services since the mid-60s. We are the largest satellite operator. We have over 52 satellites serving the globe. Obviously, with the U.S. being the major component of that, we also operate a large terrestrial network to support that, to provide seamless and unparalleled service in that. Our customers include the U.S. military, includes all the key broadcasters, and I'm very much confident that I can say that almost every single one of you rely on C-band every day without even knowing it. If you watch TV, if you listen to the radio, you are using C-band. And guess what? You have been accustomed to a very high reliable service throughout the years using C-band. So C-band is very critical to your everyday use. Intelsat is a B2B company, so we provide services to other companies that in turn provide services to the U.S. consumers and to the U.S. public. So why is C-band so special? Why do we talk about C-band? So C-band is very unique in many ways. So first of all, C-band have been allocated to satellite services for 50 years. We have been in use in this band for 50 years. So we're not squatting on the spectrum. We're not just sitting there. We have been using it for 50 years. And we are providing critical services. It's highly reliable. Again, because of this high reliability, broadcasters rely on it. The names that you see here, Discovery, Time Warner, NPR, all of these to name a few, Disney, all of these to name a few, rely on C-band because of its high reliability. There are over $70 to $80 billion of revenue associated with C-band in the U.S. Over 100 million U.S. homes rely on C-band. indirectly for their TV content. So if you watch TV, you're watching the Super Bowl, it's coming through C-band. So, and this reliability point is very important. We provide 99.999% reliability. To put this in perspective, that amounts to a little over 5 minutes of outage every year. Imagine 5 minutes of outage. And then to put it in a different perspective, a lot of us have fiber connectivity to the home and you browse the internet, but somehow we're content that sometimes you try to load a page, it doesn't come up, and you say, okay, I'm just going to click again, it will come back again. Imagine the same thing happening while you're watching the Super Bowl, while there's that last minute touchdown, and then you get interrupted. You can't reload that. So this is the difference in reliability that we provide versus the context of reliability in an IP world. Linear TV is very different. And we have all come to rely on it, and I don't think we can accept not having this reliability. So this is actually a point that I pick on from Andrew. Yes, our satellite signals are very weak because they come from 22,000 miles up. So by the time they hit the ground here, they are very faint and they are very sensitive. And that's why we have large dishes, which are essentially large ears to listen to the satellite signal. What that means is that you can't afford to have any type of noise adjacent to you, even if it's not in the same band, even if it's in the adjacent band. That's very important. You can't live with that. And it's very much like if you have a baby trying to put the baby to sleep, and then a frat house moves next door with all their parties. This is what happens if we simply allow other users that, we're going to be fine, we can get in. That's not workable. So, and then with the linear TV, when you're watching live TV, any approach that talks about remedy the interference after the fact, if you have an interference, just let us know and we'll remove it. Again, you can't afford that in live TV. If you're watching TV, you can't afford to have that. So all of these reasons tells you why C-band is very unique to the satellite industry. There is an entire ecosystem that has been built around it over the past 50 years. So with that in mind, we are also very practical people in the satellite industry. We are fairly smart, and we understand the importance of 5G because we love 5G and we want 5G to prosper and move forward. But we want to do it in a way that allows us to continue to operate and continue to provide services to our customers. So what are the key tenets of our proposal? First, we want to protect our customers. We have a large set of constituents. We have broadcasters. We have the U.S. military. We have emergency services. We have radio services. We are trying to protect these customers and ensure that they continue to provide these services and continue to be whole. The second tenet is that it's a market-based approach. What does that mean? It means that we do it directly. We, as the satellite operators, we form a consortium and we work through a market-based solution with the 5G operators to provide these services, to transfer spectrum to them in a timely fashion. The consortium also would be the technical lead on resolving any interference issues, meaning we're going to be responsible to fit every single earth station in the U.S., C-band earth stations, with the necessary equipment, necessary filtering, to make sure that they remain whole and they continue to provide services. Regulatory certainty is another key point. Regulatory certainty is important for making sure that the investors can put in money into deployments of networks. If you don't have regulatory certainty, if you're not sure that you own the spectrum, that you can actually, your investment is not going to be wasted, you can't move forward. Our approach gives the regulatory certainty, gives the regulatory certainty for us that we will continue to operate, and will also give regulatory certainty to the 5G operator who will take possession of that spectrum. And last and most importantly, speed. So as much as we love the FCC, we know that repurposing of spectrum through a regulatory process can take a very long time. On average, it takes 13 years for the FCC to repurpose spectrum from use A to use B. So, and I don't think that we can afford to do that. 5G is a race. Other countries are already deploying, and we want to make sure that this spectrum gets in the hand of 5G as fast as possible. So 5G for us is a breakthrough technology, and we are coming up with a breakthrough approach to resolve it. So we must be cognizant of that. And then I would like to talk about mythbusters. You know, a lot of the myths are about C-band. That's one of the myths is that it's underutilized or it's lightly used. This could not be farther from the truth. When you try to use counting of earth stations as a proxy for occupancy, this is a very narrow approach to judge a spectrum that this spectrum is not used. Of course, our spectrum is pristine because it is very clean. The signal comes from the satellite, is very weak. So if you're an RF engineer and you walk around with a sniffer, you're going to find that the spectrum is clean. You say, this is ideal, I want to move in. But there are critical services in this band, and they have to be protected. So as I explained to you before, the type of ecosystem that relies on C-band right now is very important, and we cannot sacrifice it, we cannot play with it. This must stay and must continue, unless we are all willing to let go of our TV and our news and our favorite radio stations. The second point is that satellite is not pro 5G. We are pro 5G. Satellite is pro 5G, and we are trying to move forward. We have worked with the mobile industry for a very long time. We enable them, they enable us in many areas around the world and in the US. So we are trying to find a way forward where 5G can get in and can get in quickly. Third, some folks have questions on what is the fastest way to get to 5G. And for us, there is really no question. It's our solution, avoids bureaucracy, avoids unproven technology, avoids the regulatory battle that would ensue. We don't want to be in a position, anybody who's pro 5G or in the satellite industry, to get into a situation where we have a prolonged regulatory battle or prolonged litigation, because what that means is that we're going to delay access to 5G. Nobody wants that. So I'm going to wrap up very, very quickly here. So the needs for speed. So like I said before, our solution is about speed. We will put spectrum in the hands of 5G operators in as little as 18 months. It's 18 months to 36 months from the time the FCC issues an order. I guarantee you that there is no other solution that's going to be as fast as this, to provide clean spectrum to 5G to start rolling out services. But at the same time, we must recognize that C-band services are critical, and they are pervasive, and they are in every day in our lives. We use them. We use C-band services indirectly. We come to rely on it. But so we must protect them. 5G is a breakthrough technology. I mean, the promise of 5G is amazing. What 5G can do, what we read about 5G, the economic opportunity is tremendous. So we have to come up with a breakthrough solution, and that's what we are doing here. We have a breakthrough solution for this breakthrough technology, and a fast one. Lastly, it's really a race. 5G is a race, and any other solution is going to take a long time. It's not going to get the U.S. to the other side of the river. We're going to be waiting and waiting and waiting, and it's going to be a prolonged regulatory battle. Other countries are deploying, and we are proposing to move fast and very fast. So, and we think that we have the most compelling solution here to move to 5G and to keep the incumbents at the same time, to keep the satellite services that are being provided, to keep them whole, and to move forward. So, thank you.
Thanks, Haz. Any quick clarifying question for Haz right now? And like I said, you'll be staying around too, right, at the end?
Yep.
Is there one? Yeah, we're back.
So.
Behind you, Kendall. Yeah.
Hi, Caleb Henry from Space News. So, Telesat, one of your competitors' potential partners on the C-band proposal that you and SES and Intel have, said that they were one of the requirement for them to join you is that they were not clear on how the consortium would compensate partners within it, and it appeared that Intelsat and SES would decide who gets money from mobile operators in exchange for moving them out of the band.
Yeah.
Can you just clarify how that would be done, and have you addressed Telesat's concerns?
Sure. This is not entirely accurate. Let me say that, first of all, between Intelsat and SES, there is about over 95% of the U.S. market in C-band, right? Eutelsat, for example, has made comments that they are very much interested in joining. So they have made public positive comments about our proposal. Telesat, I understand their point, but I think they make a very small portion of C-band services in the U.S. So again, we understand there are issues, but like I said, you have to look at the critical mass that we are at right now. So if you have Intelsat and SES and potentially Eutelsat, you're pretty much over 98% of the U.S. So.
There's one up here.
So, and it will be prorated, whatever the situation, everything will be prorated according to their share.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Peter Flynn from Viasat. So could you clarify one point for me, because there seemed to be a conflict up here. On one hand, you start out saying C-band is heavily utilized, critical part of the infrastructure, but we can free up 100 megahertz, or
Yes.
even now 200 or 300 megahertz now, from what I've heard. And so how do you reconcile the two? Is it if there's 300 megahertz of unutilized spectrum, let's have at it. But
Well, I didn't say it 300. I said the proposal, and perhaps I did not say that very clearly. So the proposal right now is to clear 100 plus because there's guard band issues. So 100 plus of spectrum to mobile. We could potentially do more in the future. There's other tools in the toolbox that we can use, but at the moment, what we can do is 100 plus. But like I said, there are other ways that we can try to be more creative. But right now it stands about at 100. So, any other questions?
Okay. Well, thank you, Haz.
Thank you.
We'll move on to the panel.
Okay.
So you all to come up. Thanks. So what I'll do is introduce each panelist, again, very briefly because you have bios on the handout, and then give them a chance, like 2 minutes to just give kind of highlights of their perspective, because we have, quite a diverse group up here. So just kind of moving straight across, starting at the end with Ross Lieberman, who's the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs at the American Cable Association. ACA represents the interest of small and medium-sized cable operators. So Ross?
Sure.
Tell us why you're here.
Yep. Thanks a lot for having me here, and I'm here to express our views from the perspective of MVPDs, particularly small and medium-sized cable television operators. So I'd just start by saying, virtually all MVPDs across the country, including hundreds of small and medium-sized operators, utilize the C-band to pick up video programming that they deliver to more than 90 million subscribers across the country. The C-band is the most heavily used medium for delivering video programming to cable operators and satellite providers, as well as to broadcasters and others. It's favored by video programmers because, number one, it's reliable, and number two, it's cost efficient. And for cable operators, in addition to those reasons, it's low cost. The programmer actually pays for the cost to actually receive it via C-band. But for many small cable operators, their only means of receiving the C-band services today is, video programming today is via the C-band, because alternative opportunities for them are extremely, they're unavailable, inadequate, or inefficient, and they come along with expensive costs. And for a lot of smaller operators in rural America, who are operating video services at low margins and don't have many subscribers, those costs are just unbearable. For these reasons, there's a stunning number of video programming services that are delivered over the C-band today, and those demands are likely to increase over time. So ACA went through did research on the number of how it's being used today. There's over 2,000 video channels that are being delivered over C-band, over 308 transponders covering 24 satellites. And with the advent of 4K, which takes up more capacity than HD, that demand is only going to grow. Now, ACA supports more efficient spectrum use. We also support the proceeding that the FCC is undertaking to allow more intensive use of the band. But the FCC, in considering additional uses of the C-band, really has to take into account what additional uses will mean how they will impact existing fixed satellite services as well as its users. And such an evaluation, in our mind, must follow the Hippocratic principle of first doing no harm. And that principle applies especially strong with regards to small cable operators who are providing a special link between their customers and video programming services, which does provide important news and other information to them. I know we'll talk more in detail about the specific proposals, but I thought I'd, for now, just highlight, our view is that a lot more detail needs to be made available about these proposals. And there are many questions that are still they're still left unanswered, and I'll just raise three very quickly. So first is, how are the various proposals would work as a technical matter while enabling the continued use of the C-band without interruption or technical constraint? The second question relates to, how is the proposals impact the quality and cost of providing the video service and to the day-to-day operations of existing users? And if there are costs, how are those costs going to be reimbursed? I'm hopeful this panel will help to answer some of those questions, and certainly the proceeding that's coming up. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Ross. Next, we have Michelle Farquhar, who is counsel to SES on this issue, and a partner at Hogan Lovells, also a former chief of the Wireless Bureau at the FCC. Michelle.
Thank you, Michael. I'm here representing SES, which is also one of the largest satellite operators throughout the world. They have 50 satellites in orbit right now, and 19 are authorized right now to provide C-band service to U.S. customers. And they're already at virtually full capacity, as we've told the FCC. They provide high-quality transmission content to over 100 million U.S. Households, as has been noted. And, of course, as it's a joint proposal, I agree with everything Haas has said from Intelsat about the importance of balancing two public interest imperatives. The first is continuing to support Ross and his customers and all the video programming operators and cable companies and broadcasters who they and their customers are relying on this high-quality service for their programming, and also the ongoing business of these satellite operators. They've all invested billions of dollars so far and will lose some real opportunity costs, even with their own proposal. The second is the need to clear a portion of the band to facilitate U.S. leadership for mobile 5G. And that's something that I know the satellite operators had resisted in the past, but it's become an imperative. And they've acknowledged that. It's a breakthrough, as Haas said. And so we've decided to come up with a breakthrough approach to facilitate that. But it's really a balance of those two goals. Neither one is easy, but as I'll explain in a minute, there are a lot of clearing tools that we can use, all of which are expensive and will take time and effort, but it can be done. So this balance, we believe, creates a win-win scenario that really does serve the public interest. Again, these are two important public interest goals that need to be balanced. But we also believe it's important not to pile on too much here, and that's our biggest concern with the BAC proposal. Not that point-to-multipoint service isn't important, it is. It's a real excellent tool for rural areas, but it might be piling on too much in this band and really need to see more technical studies about how that might work. And in particular, why would the FCC want to incentivize the current incumbents to move and clear out of the band, but then impair the band in new ways that will cause potentially greater interference to then squeezing more into less capacity, and that could hurt Ross and his ACA customers and all the providers of video programming. And it's not clear how quickly that these point-to-multipoint providers can adjust to the constant shifting of channels that the satellite operators need to do for all sorts of reasons, or to interference that might be caused. And because of the high quality and high reliability nature of our contracts, we really need to be able to do it quickly. So that's critical as part of what we have to do. And I mentioned the clearing that needs to be done. That's really what it's all about. It's about speed. And as Haas mentioned, we've looked really hard, we've studied hard the market side of the proposal as well as the clearing tools that would be necessary. And we've put in the record that at least 4 different types of tools: regrooming traffic, adding additional satellites, which is no small undertaking, upgrading reception through filters and mitigation techniques, and finally possible relocation and fibering, only on an as-needed basis if needed. But those are all very expensive. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars to do this type of thing, maybe more. It's hard to know. But we're still trying to get our arms around how many Earth stations are out there. Just since the FCC put out a public notice, there have been 1,200 new Earth stations that have been identified, and apparently a lot more to come. So this is not a small undertaking. So, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Next, we have Jill Canfield, who is Vice President and Assistant General Counsel at NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. Jill advocates on behalf of NTCA's 850 small and rural telecom providers. Jill?
Thank you. At NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association, we represent the companies serving the most rural parts of the country. Our average subscriber density is 7 per square mile as compares to 130 per square mile for the larger providers. And because of where they serve and the density constraints of where they serve, they use a variety of technologies to reach those consumers and offer a variety of service. Now, I would say many of our members offer a mobile broadband product. Most offer a video product, so we have a lot of overlap with ACA in terms of membership. But all of our members offer fixed broadband. Fiber is the preferred technology, but there's also fixed wireless. And fiber is the preferred technology because it's dependable and predictable. You know, if it's not working the way you expect it, there's usually a kink in the wire, or there's a fiber break or something. Wireless is a little more art than science in some respects. But fixed wireless certainly has its place in bringing broadband service to rural Americas. We have our membership, those that are paying attention anyway, are very excited about the mid-band spectrum because it has the capacity and capability to offer products somewhat very similar to what they can offer fiber and certainly what the consumers expect. I think because of the membership that we serve, we're in a unique position because we have a lot of overlapping and competing interests, but all with a singular goal, and that is to serve the rural customer. And I think that our members, do it better than anyone else does. We are situated in the communities we serve, and therefore have an interest in making sure we get the service out. Certainly do a much better job than some of the larger providers out there. And my job as an advocate for these companies is to ensure that the rural companies continue to have the opportunities to serve the rural customers. And I believe that mid-band spectrum really is going to be an essential part of getting that service out to the rural consumer. Obviously, we don't want to see interference, certainly not with our own members. But the members have been relying on spectrum for a very long time to meet the needs of the most far-out consumers. It can be an economical way to get to the consumers where you just can't get fiber because of either terrain constraints or the ranch is miles from the roadway, where the ranch home is miles from the roadway. So fixed wireless is a really important piece of what our members are offering. I think it's really important to be honest and realistic about what the technology can do today and what it will be able to do in the future. I think that a lot of what we talk about is very short-sighted. We're not talking about what technology is going to be able to fix. I think that it's important for our policymakers to really think about what is the highest and best use for the spectrum, and I think that depending on who you talk to in this panel and industry, the highest and best use for spectrum is going to differ, of course. We think it's important to bridge that urban-rural divide in broadband and to make sure that this mid-band spectrum is a part of that. I have some concerns with the satellite proposal in that it's really just a push to get spectrum into the hands of the big three, and that leaves our members out and it leaves the rural consumer out. So I do have concern and would be interested in hearing how that need might be addressed. But thank you for having me. I look forward to the discussion.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Next, we have Chris Wisorek, who is the Director of Spectrum Policy at T-Mobile USA, and he assists in developing competition, spectrum, and technology policy and advising on legal matters as well. Chris?
Thank you for inviting me here today. T-Mobile, we're one of the wireless carriers here. And we're, wanted to drive home, I think, 3 points for this discussion today. I think one is something I think everyone in this room agrees with. The race for 5G is a national priority. It's a critical issue. 5G will manifest itself in many different ways, uses some parts of the spectrum, spectrum that we'd never ever thought about using before, either for mobile or for fixed purpose. But I think we all agree that it's critically important that the U.S. leads in 5G like we led in 4G. It created all sorts of great opportunities that the U.S. was able to capitalize on, and that's very important. I think the second thing we want to focus on in this discussion is the ability to actually do this, to repurpose a spectrum. I've gone through a lot of rodeos now with spectrum repurposing, starting in the AWS 1 context, if anyone remembers that. That was where T-Mobile, we spent at the time our largest CapEx spend of over about $4 billion of buying spectrum and put it to use in about 18 months. Most recently, we had the FCC 600 megahertz incentive auction where we spent $10 billion and we put it to use in 2 months. So it was a pretty big time frame, and what we're seeing now, we're spending more money and putting spectrum to use much quicker. So those are things that could bode well for some of the proposals that have been brought out. But it's critically important that we get more spectrum out in that regard on the technical side. And the third part is kind of the money aspect, the incentives. To move and repurpose spectrum from one purpose to another, you have to have, I guess, an agreement of incentives for maybe the majority of the people, at least the right people who are involved in the matter, to be able to put spectrum to its highest and best use. Inevitably, there'll be some different disagreements, but there's a well-drawn and well-trodden path throughout U.S. policymaking and spectrum matters to have spectrum brought to its highest and best use and what the proper incentives are. So those are the 3 things I think we'll focus on today.
Great. And then finally, Jamie Fink, who is CTO and co-founder of Mimosa Networks, a global technology leader in fiber-fast wireless broadband, fixed wireless broadband, right, primarily. And Jamie's a member of the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee at the FCC and also a founding member of Broadband Access Coalition, which is advocating for sharing the C-band for fixed wireless.
Great. Thank you, Michael. So a couple things. First, I agree with everything Andy said. Secondly, I think the coalition, first of all, there's about 35 members in the coalition. It was founded by ourselves, New America, as well as the Wireless ISP Association, WISPA, a number of other people that I don't have time to list all of them. But we enjoy support from almost every rural telco, both Tier 2 and Tier 3 in the country, NTCA, of course, the Rural Wireless Association, of course, also cellular providers as well that are providing necessary cooperative services and phone services and DSL, et cetera, in the rural areas. So I don't want to touch too much on rural because I think you did a fantastic job of it. But I mean, with the work I do with the FCC and all of the work that we've done with this petition, it was very clear that yes, we need to open up more spectrum, but it's not all about 5G. There is an absolute priority for rural broadband. So we believe that no matter what the odds may be, and as you can tell, there's a bit of a target on the back of spectrum sharing with something that has been in the band, and we want to reuse unused portions of geography and unused portions of frequencies because we are not using it efficiently. So not to disrespect, we do believe that there is underutilization, but there's a lot of use that needs to be protected with the satellite industry. So we were very, very clear, and I want to dispel a couple of myths about our proposal. We are 100% here to protect the satellite industry. Number one, that was the first thing we said in our proposal. Number two, a lot of people have characterized the proposal as it's going to be like unlicensed use. Look, we've been doing licensed microwave technology for decades now. And now more recently, with a lot of the technologies Google and others have worked on, we've come up with very dynamic technologies and databases to be able to solve these problems. So we have tools for very sensitive microwaves technologies that are no less sensitive in many ways than a lot of the satellite technology. We look forward to doing the continued technology analysis. We've put forth many technical detailed proposals, very specific changes to the rules, ITU recommendations that talk through exactly how to protect satellites, and we've referenced those studies very carefully and done those studies. We certainly look forward to making sure that we do this the right way, because there's no way to share spectrum without making sure that we don't interfere with the incumbent. So we welcome that debate because we think they've done a fantastic job of defending what they need. They need that spectrum continued for satellite, and that's also proven why we can't just clear the band. So in that context, there really is, in my view, a win-win-win. There is something that can be there for rural broadband if we work together on the technical aspects of sharing, with the caveat that we may not interfere, and we need to come up with mechanisms to be able to be dynamic, because as you've heard from the counterparts on the satellite side, they make changes. They need to make changes as their customers need different channels, different frequencies. But I believe that that's attainable. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater because it's too much work or it's hard. It's something that technology can solve, and we can do that today and do that very rapidly, in my opinion. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Jamie. Well, why don't we, to get a discussion going, and then we'll, and then later we'll go to the audience, but pick up on the last point you made about sort of this assumption that we can't clear the entire C-band for exclusive mobile licensing, and I'm wondering, why not? Chris, T-Mobile has suggested that it ought to be considerably more than 100 megahertz of the C-band should be cleared for mobile. So how much, and how would you do it, and how long will it take?
Well, I'm going to ask the first question to the audience. How many folks here in the last 24 hours, and I'm getting in trouble here, have watched live linear television? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So about 15% of the audience, 85% of the audience has not watched live linear television in the last 24 hours. I don't think I'm going out on a very big stretch here. Linear television is dying. That's just my opinion. I don't. It's still out there, and it's still out there. I mean, AT&T has committed itself to linear television, and what our CEO thinks about AT&T. But the linear television world is not an expanding way. There are lots of people watching television. The funny thing is, television is growing. It's amazing. It's more popular than ever. It's Netflix, and Netflix doesn't come across the C-band. So we think there's a lot of ways to get more content, get HD, Ultra HD, HDR, all sorts of great video programming through alternative mechanisms. So we think that let's look at getting as much as we can out of the C-band. If there's 500 megahertz there, why not look at that 500 megahertz and try to find the most narrow or least amount of spectrum that's necessary to serve the purposes. I talked with folks over at NPR a while back, and they pointed out that they need for very rural, very remote radio receiving locations. Well, that's very understandable. It's a great application use for C-band applications. That's a relatively low data rate audio feed. You don't need to be sending a HDR stream into Manhattan on the C-band because there's all sorts of fiber options that go into Manhattan, which are probably better served and a better way to provide that content. So that's kind of my thought, is I think we have to look at the practicalities there.
Okay. And there's, of course, a number of other stakeholders we could have had here. I don't want to channel, I'm going to get to you in a second. Okay. I don't want to channel like National Public Radio too much, but for example, in terms of, we're done with anything that's live audio or live video, and NPR has already been said filings that the entire National Public Radio system, 475 stations, relies for almost entirely live, programming on those 475 earth stations, many of which are in rural and small town areas. But Ross is here, so Ross, is that right? Are we almost done with with live news and sports and more specifically, your member, or less rhetorically, your members, if T-Mobile pays the bill, or Verizon or AT&T, can they switch over fairly quickly to rely entirely on fiber and KU band, for example?
Yeah. Well, again, 90 million households today receive video service. So, I mean, you might look at the trends, and the trends might be decreasing, but by no stretch of the imagination are people going to be giving up on linear video service anytime soon. And you think that a question of do people want to get it over the top or get better broadband service or get video programming, linear video programming, it's not an either or question. They want both. And they don't want to, and if you told them you're no longer going to get video programming in exchange for the promise of higher broadband speeds, I don't think many people would take that today. And while there may be multiple options in an urban area to be getting the highest speed broadband services wirelessly, it's not the same in rural America. Speeds are far, far slower in rural America. And this puts a real significant risk of cutting off rural America entirely if we're talking about giving up 200, 300, 400, the entire band, the entire C-band.
And the satellite business in the C-band is actually growing, not shrinking. There's new customers because there are so many new MVPT outlets that want this programming, and that's how they receive the linear as well as the other types of programming. It's often through the C-band.
So is SES, where does SES come down on the portion of the band that could be cleared entirely?
Well,
no more video distribution?
We have said that we can clear with 100 megahertz plus guard band within 18 months to 3 years. But you just can't find a way to do it any faster or more than that faster.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, personally, I think, I agree with the need, and I fall towards the future of streaming, of course. Personally, I cut the cord, and I don't need a satellite. I just get it over the internet. But the rural areas can't do that because they can't get internet. The issue I take, I think, with the mobile industry's comments on this is that this band is not necessarily friendly for rural areas for mobile. It's really small cell in urban areas. So you got to clear everything just to make urban work. And that's really crazy if we don't take advantage of that and use that asset and resource more efficiently to offer rural broadband. At the end of the day, 95% of internet traffic still goes over fixed connections. So I can't just replace a broadband connection today that's too slow to actually stream on, so we can't get that. And we really are stuck with a linear feed in a lot of those rural areas for that reason alone. But I can't replace it with a mobile product with this band either in those rural areas. So not to be disingenuous, but we have to have a really balanced approach here because 5G is not going to be on this band out in rural areas, fundamentally. It's not what we expect.
What about, kind of as a follow-up to this, part of if I recall correctly, part of the original Intelsat and Intel proposal was that the commission could authorize private market deals to clear C-band only in big cities, only in metro areas, because that's probably, that's obviously where it's much more valuable to mobile carriers who want the capacity to densify, their networks where there's high traffic, high ARPU, and that would avoid the rural problem. So with that, is that something the FCC should do? Should they authorize, if they're going to allow private market deals, allow the market deals to just be where the value is highest for mobile? Chris?
I would say look at all of America. The nice thing about the situation with mobile broadband, I can tell you at T-Mobile, I've spent an inordinate amount of time working on getting broadband to rural America. I've spent a lot of time working on trying to get sites up in Fort Peck, Montana, serving an Indian reservation. And it uses low-band spectrum, but also uses mid-band spectrum. And I know we would definitely be looking at using all the spectrum we have available on the sites. The nice thing about when you buy these radios is not only does it support one particular band, but it normally supports a whole canopy of bands, including the AWS band or PCS band or 2.5 or hopefully in the future 3.7 to 4.2. So when the equipment's there, there would be possibility to be put it to use. So I would focus primarily on the bigger cities because it's going to drive the economies of scale and stuff like that. That's where you get the real benefits. But I want to leave out rural America.
And I would just say, if I could say, that history, if it's any guide, shows that when the larger carriers get access to any kind of resource like that, it makes sense. You're going to build out in the urban areas. And you do some rural areas potentially because there's a public interest benefit to doing that and a public perception benefit to serving certain rural areas. But historically, large companies have not done a good job of serving rural America. And I don't see this technology changing that dynamic. Just you can make the money in the cities, and it's just a different business model. It's a different build-out model. So it's really hard for me, having worked in the rural industry for 20 years now, to see how that is a real likely proposition.
So Russ, if we could just clear, let's say above 100 megahertz, then maybe the next 200 megahertz, clear the top 100 metropolitan areas only, and leave C-band in the rural areas. Does that work for you? For cable?
I think you have to consider what that actually would mean for the marketplace for programmers who are relying on the C-band. The programmers today are paying for the C-band through fees paid by cable and satellite providers in every single market across the country. And so if you all of a sudden lop off the 50 largest markets, and those providers and those cable operators are no longer paying for the C-band services, and the programmers still have their same C-band costs, they're going to have to pass those costs on to somebody. And those are going to be to the remaining users. And either those in rural areas that are still using the C-band are going to see their prices skyrocket, or the programmers are just going to discontinue offering that service at all. And so I think the market-by-market approach, I can understand certain degrees of attractiveness to that, but I think you can't have that at the expense of higher prices in rural America or the discontinuation of service.
SES talked to both its customers and to mobile providers and just didn't see any way that worked. And so when the joint proposal came together, we decided it would be better to have a holistic approach and avoid the market-by-market approach. That didn't seem to be viable.
So when you're talking about 100 megahertz as a
would be
goal,
across
that's
the board.
nationwide.
Nationwide.
Is there I don't know if you would necessarily...
Because once you clear, you're basically clearing across the board. So you don't, once you've done that, you don't, it's hard to continue to send.
I think the problem is 100 megahertz in the 5G world is just not a lot.
Yeah, Chris, what does that, if it's 100 megahertz, what does that mean, practically speaking, in terms of mobile competition?
I can go right up to the 5 gigahertz band that's unlicensed and get 1,000 megahertz. Right. Why go for 100 megahertz at slightly better propagation characteristics when I get 1,000 megahertz at unlicensed and I don't have to pay anybody? I mean, it's just logic. I mean, that's where you build equipment and stuff like that. And it's, we should be looking at trying to get as much spectrum out of this proposal and have the incentives aligned. One other thing I would observe is I'm going to go back to the incentive auction case, which I think was a really good success of trying to take spectrum that was used by a lot of people. The incentive auction case, depending on how you want to look at how many receivers are out there, people watching over-the-air television, 30 million, 60 million TVs kind of were watching television, I guess you could say, somewhere on a monthly basis. In this context, we're dealing with at best, 4, 5, 6,000 receivers? And that's actually, it's a really good thing from the technology side, from fixing the problem. And we're in the incentive auction, 600 megahertz, we're looking at 1,000 transmitters. Here we're looking at 30 or 20, thereabouts, depending on the transponders you want to count, and a couple birds. So it is from the engineering side, the solution is more manageable in my mind. It's just getting the right incentives out there. And I think incentives, and by the way, I'll be clear, money, cash. The way you get cash is you have a lot of out there, a lot of options, a lot of choices, and then you direct it to the right people. And 100 megahertz is just not a lot of spectrum in my mind, and won't necessarily get that kind of incentives.
But do we need 100 megahertz when we look at the context of all of the other spectrum that's becoming available? Obviously, the new EBS spectrum coming in 2.5, which I'm sure your friends will be all over, that's a big asset, as well as millimeter wave technology. And millimeter wave is never going to work in rural. We know that, right? So we have to pick the best tool for the right job and make sure it gets into the right people's hands. And that's why we have all of these guys going after CAF money wanting to support our proposal, because they know this is the only way they can affordably deliver broadband. We don't want to have to fight about geographic areas again, like happened in CBRS, because we just are going to end up with fallowed areas and nobody agreeing. Yeah. So
that's a good point, if I may interject. So we began the CBRS, the 3.5 band, is what it is. Everybody say CBS, it's really the 3.5 band. We began this discussion back in 2011, thereabouts. And here we are in 2018. There's not a single 3.5 gigahertz device available for sale. But also, if you remember, in the incentive auction, what started in about 2010, 2011, we're well through the process of getting the incentive auction complete. There are 300,000 devices out there in consumers' hands that are using the band. There's more than 1,000 cell sites out there. And we're going to, T-Mobile at least is going to have, I don't know, hundreds of millions of people, at least tens of millions of people covered by the end of this year on that band. So you can see when the incentives are aligned, you put spectrum to its highest and best use, or we can talk about it for more panels. So I mean, I think that's the options.
I hear 100 megahertz. I'm wondering, is it actually 100 megahertz? Is there a guard band?
Plus guard band.
Plus guard band of how much?
Within a time frame. We've been clear that that's within 3 years. That's how much we can clear.
So how much more of the guard band?
It could be as much as 50. It could be as much as 50 megahertz.
So we're talking 150 megahertz that we're clearing, not just
that's likely.
100.
Again, the guard band's not clear at the moment.
Yeah.
That's what we think at the moment.
So that is there enough?
So that leaves 350, which is a much smaller space to squeeze the remaining C-band. And it will take, again, probably more satellites,
So,
a lot of work, a lot of expense to
so
make
for
that
example,
work. This is the biggest clearing project that's ever even been conceived of.
Yeah, and I mentioned NPR. I believe they said that they are on that bottom 100 megahertz, so they'll have to move to a 36 megahertz transponder somewhere higher up in the band. So do you imagine all that, all the activity, all the the C-band operations in that bottom 150, is that all moving to spare capacity on different transponders, or is a lot of it going to fiber?
There's no spare anything. That's the problem. That's why we'd have to launch new satellites.
So there'll be a new satellite.
That's going to be very expensive, and that's going to take time and a lot of planning that would need to be done. But it's going to be, I mentioned a number of different tools that SES has decided would be part of the toolkit, but that includes regrooming traffic, adding additional satellites, upgrading reception, a lot of filtering, mitigation techniques, and relocation and fibering. That's the most expensive in many ways and the most difficult to do. So that, and very, very costly, especially where there's no fiber. Haas can add to that, but he's giving the thumbs up.
But these details are important to kind of to understand. I think the proposal thus far that has been put forth has not gone into this level of has not gone into the level of specificity necessary in order to properly evaluate what would be the result of trying to do this and how existing users would deal with those consequences.
And they're very concerned.
Yeah, yeah.
We're hearing from them all the time.
Exactly. The filtering, the costs, the dish size, compression that we use, these are all costs. And we haven't really focused a lot on this, but how does that type of those costs get reimbursed? What is eligible for reimbursement? Who makes the decisions for that reimbursement? All of that stuff is really critical to understand in order to for the commission to make an informed decision.
It doesn't sound like an 18-month decision-making process to me, just based on history. And I have some concerns about what I'm hearing here, because the spectrum clearing idea, whether it's 100 megahertz or 500 megahertz, it really does seem like a plan to put spectrum in the hands of the big three mobile wireless providers to relieve congestion and capacity issues in urban areas. So we're talking about a nationwide plan to serve 3 carriers serving discrete, basically the coasts of the country and discrete other cities, but leaving out the whole middle of the country that right now, by the maps that we have seen, don't have a lot of interference or wouldn't have interference concerns. So maybe it just doesn't. The idea of getting service to all Americans, that plan does not meet that.
Can I just say, I don't want to only be picking on the satellite folks, because
No, that's okay, you can.
I mean, the other plan has a lot of questions as well. I mean, is it feasible in order to kind of do some type of sharing in the existing band, you know, between the spaces that you know, existing Earth stations aren't using? I mean, there is a lot of video programming that is being offered down there, and while in one location somebody may not be using every single service, they sometimes decide, I'm going to carry this programming that I wasn't carrying before. Or the programming vendor that they have decides to go from one satellite provider to another and using different transponders. And so how are we going to be able to respond to that in a way that will not limit choice? I mean, if you're, you know, and what information is a cable operator going to have to provide in order to tell other users what it's doing and when it gets updated, and what happens when there's interference from these users? Today, there's no other users of the C-band that's creating interference. Consumers do not lose service as a result of your C-band service having interference. What we are talking about now is creating that possibility, and perhaps happening a lot. What are going to be the mechanisms in order to resolving that? Are we going to have to file a letter with the FCC in order, you know, and ask the FCC to resolve this, you know, a day before the Super Bowl is about to come on, because all of a sudden somebody made a mistake in terms of how they're operating their service? So, I mean, I don't want to, you know, both of these ideas have their issues that need to be aired out, and we need to fully understand.
One thing I was going to ask anyway, just since you already mentioned it, was in terms of capacity for C-band, that, you know, Comcast, I think, has been pointing out that there, you know, we may be just at the beginning of an effort to expand the resolution of television toward 4K. And I know you have concerns with different concerns with next-gen TV, but isn't that a part of next-gen TV, is that it'll be potentially higher resolution, which will take up more capacity on satellites?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, that's where things are migrating towards, HD to 4K, and a lot of all the services today, other than a very small number of video services, are at most offering HD, and 4K can be take up twice as much capacity than HD. While there may be more capacity, well, there may be better compression that can be employed to mitigate some of that increase. We're talking about a significant increase in the amount of C-band that would be required if, you know, 2,000 channels all of a sudden went from offering service in HD to 4K.
Well, one thing I want to come back, I think probably maybe starting with Chris, but I'm sure everyone will have a view. Because I know, you know, I'll pick on Chris because T-Mobile has been very outspoken on this proceeding, even before the proceeding, right? And but one thing that we haven't talked about much here that T-Mobile's pointed out is this whole question of, I mean, what's fairly unprecedented, if it is what the commission proposes next week, is that this clearing and reallocation of spectrum will be done through private market deals. Potentially, you know, private negotiations or a private auction. So T-Mobile has suggested that voluntary market deals are inadequate, and so I'm wondering, why is that? I mean, should the FCC mandate the clearing of a certain number of megahertz, or should it go toward an auction, you know, a traditional auction or incentive auction mechanism? I mean, what should it be doing different if you don't think private market deals are working well?
As I'm sure people have kind of picked up my hints, I think the incentive auction process works well in the 600 megahertz context. And a lot of the same factors, issues between incumbencies, incentives, technology issues, exist in this context as well, but actually in a lesser degree, lesser scale. I would disagree with Michelle slightly in the sense that the C-band transition is going to be a less complex process than the 600 megahertz transition. Or even a 700 megahertz DTV transition, right? You're not converting people from analog to digital, you know, hundreds of millions of, you know, viewers and stuff like that. At the end of the day, we're dealing with a couple different transmitters up in the sky with 2, potentially 3 entities, and a couple thousand sites that, you know, are being focused on as receiving, or maybe, you know, 10,000 sites. We're not dealing with millions of sites. Now, obviously, it has cascading ripple effects throughout the entire ecosystem of video delivery, which is no ifs, ands, or buts about that. But whether it's last mile for television broadband television distribution for the 600 megahertz context, or the middle mile, what we're seeing here, there are different ways to deal with it. And we think that an incentive auction process is probably a pretty good way to be looking at ways of dealing with this, because it has the mechanisms of licensing issues. You have the rulemaking procedures. You have our reimbursement funds you could deal with. You can spread the wealth around, for lack of a better way to say it. So it definitely helps to have a government entity to be out there to serve as the arbitrator to ensure that things get done. You know, a good example, T-Mobile, we're doing private deals in 600 megahertz. We've done 700 megahertz and the like. But at the end of the day, clearing the spectrum is not solely reliant on private deals. It's an incentive to help things go faster. But you do have the FCC out there saying, okay, by July 3rd, 2020, the transition has to get done. So it helps to have both.
What about speed to market? You need the TV incentive auction. Now, I know it was the first time an incentive auction had ever been held, but it was at least a 6-year process. Wouldn't private market deals work much faster?
You would think so, but that's not necessarily always the case, because even in a best case private market situation, you're going to have a lot of people who may not necessarily feel they benefited from the private transaction, who will put up a stink, like what I said. That's very challenging, I think. And it's an opportunity for everyone's voice to be heard, taken into account, and the FCC to make decisions on. I think that is very helpful.
So, I mean, my question, I guess, is, so you guys are going to be unhappy with not everybody getting 100 megahertz each, right? That's I think what all of the 5G operators are saying. And I mean, there's diminishing return. We can't go too far, move the line too far up, where the satellite and the TV industry simply can't operate the way they do today. So I guess my real question is, like, if it's only going to be 100 usable and 150 cleared, is it really worth it if nobody's going to be happy with only getting like a 20 megahertz channel, or having a heck of a fight to get a larger chunk of that in a city? I mean, I don't think we've seen on the record that there's anything that I mean, they're very reliant on what is up in the sky and on the ground. I don't see how we can get the amount of spectrum. I know the FCC has been disappointed by not getting hopefully more, but the reality is we have to protect this investment.
Part of the issue here is that this is shared spectrum. So unlike the TV broadcast exclusive licenses, because it's shared among the satellite operators here, it makes it difficult, if not impossible, to do the traditional incentive auction akin to what was done in the TV broadcast space. So therefore, the consortium approach would allow an incentive-like auction to be had on a market basis. It could be a market deal. It can be done a lot of different ways. But it will determine how much spectrum the private entities want for mobile use. And it will facilitate getting that done very fast. So I disagree with Chris in terms of speed. Unlike how long the whole TV broadcast incentive auction or some of the previous auctions, which often took as long as 10 to 13 years, this could be done within 6 months.
I would point out the 600 megahertz TV spectrum is actually very much shared. Tell that to the LPTV guys who got no money initially. They were, what, 5,000 LPTV translators out there, who many of them made quite a stink about the fact that they didn't receive any compensation. The number of broadcast auxiliary service. These wireless microphones that we're using probably don't have licenses that are wireless microphones that operate in the UHF band. And I can tell you, I sent out from under my name hundreds of letters telling them they had to shut their wireless microphones off. I can tell you how many people sent letters back to me saying, I want cash for that. So there is going to be shared spectrum. And again, it comes down to you're going to find somebody's going to benefit from transaction. And then other people who don't benefit feel like they ought to also benefit. And when the FCC policymakers are in that role, it comes out a little bit easier for the public good, the public interest.
The FCC could still be an arbitrator in this whole, and they will be, of course. They're talking about licenses on both sides and important customers, the whole video programming market here in the US. So I think they would be the arbitrator of this. But unlike TV translators or microphones, they haven't made billions of dollars of investment, and they don't have to do hundreds of millions of dollars of relocation and not being moved to new spectrum. They're getting squeezed to less spectrum, which is very different. A lot of lost opportunity costs.
I want to ask, I guess, one last question and then go to the audience, because I don't think I've picked on Jamie enough. So, so I just want to, you know, kind of playing devil's advocate, and Chris kind of alluded to this earlier when he mentioned 5 gigahertz unlicensed. The mobile industry is bullish on using millimeter wave. You know, Verizon, someone from Verizon is here, and they're using 28 gigahertz. So millimeter wave is 28 gigahertz and above, the spectrum frontier. They're going to use some of that for fixed wireless, for 5G. So why can't WISPs and other small and rural ISPs, Jill's members, rely on millimeter wave spectrum, or even just on, you know, stick with your unlicensed in the future?
Yeah, I mean, unlicensed, obviously, if you go to tower sites, you're out of capacity already. So to your point, you know, you're almost at, you know, 700 megahertz right now, a little bit less, but you're already getting noise at those sites because it's almost self-interference at that point. So WISPs are out of capacity. The telcos don't want to use unlicensed spectrum. They want regulatory certainty. Reality with millimeter wave it's great in urban. It just fundamentally is not going to get the job done in foliage when you go to lower elevations on utility poles or rooftops. And in higher capacity areas, just even light residential, simply you're not going to be able to get through the foliage with the reliability and the speeds that we need. We know that 5 gigahertz penetrates pretty well, not well enough to give us non-line of sight service. So going down with the experience that we've had with 2.5, we know obviously going lower in spectrum is better. It gives us the reliability that is needed and the non-line of sight performance. So we absolutely are finding in fixed wireless, it is all about the midband for us to be able to get enough penetration in the residential areas, which are all about foliage. So right now, you simply cannot easily provide any near line of sight or non-line of sight service in rural areas. And we can't do that without getting more spectrum, and we need some regulatory certainty to do it. But millimeter wave is a great answer for the cellular industry and small cell and probably backhaul for 5G as well, but it's certainly not the answer for residential areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, and I know that even from the TV white space deployment we were involved in, which has been done now, or is mostly done, up in the Maryland Panhandle, mm-hmm. near West Virginia, the Deep Creek area. And even though it's a rural and rugged area, people live in clusters of housing, but those clusters are heavily, lots of trees, yeah. And so on. So that would be needed. Anything on that, Jill, or can we?
Well, the other thing I would just say is the distance that need to be covered in rural areas. I mean, you're going to have those clusters, but a lot of the areas aren't so clustered together, and you just can't get the distance you would need to really have it as a rural solution.
Yeah, I mean, typically we see 10-mile needs in the rural world, and there's going to be some foliage. You're not always going to be able to hit that unless we definitely can't do it with 5 gigahertz. It just doesn't have the propagation that we need. So.
Yeah, and the licensing areas for millimeter wave right now are also very large. All right, so how about we have time for some questions. Definitely tell us, who you're with, who you are, who you're with. And
thank you. I'm David Bain with Technology Safety Council. I also happen to serve on the IEEE and TIA Satellite Engineering Standards Committee. My question is, has there been any discussion about use of any of the breakthrough technologies that have come to light recently that provide a degree of mutual transparency between conventionally modulated signals and any of the new technologies that, especially exactly in the lower midband, provide mutual transparency? In other words, why not keep the legacy services in a conventionally modulated way and use the new technologies for the new services so that they won't interfere? I'm talking about transpositional modulation and full duplex and a couple of others. Thank you.
I know, yeah, Haz, can you?
I can take that. So, in fact, that is one of the tools in the toolbox is that we're looking at compression, but these things also have standards to be set. They have the standards have not been fully fleshed out for higher compression. That is one area. That's, like I said, one of the tools in the toolbox to be able to do what we are proposing is to go into compression and into higher order modulation to be able to do more with less. Having said that, the satellite services, just like I was describing, and I'll be happy to answer again in discussion, they are very highly sensitive. So certain types of modulation are difficult to achieve because of the very low signal levels that we receive from satellites. So we don't have the luxury like we do in terrestrial services to be aggressive. But having said that, in the past few years, things have gotten a lot better, but still not to the point where we can, push it as much as you have in mind. But it's moving in that direction, and that's one of the tools. Thank you.
I'll add, I'm also an IEEE member, former president of our student branch. I'm going to go geeky here. We're going to go, for terrestrial purposes, we will use every coding technique, every modulation scheme, and I'm sure we'll find a way for like massive MIMO or other transposition lean schemes to use it up and theoretically cause interference.
Ditto.
Yeah. Yeah.
Other questions or comments out there? Yes. I'll turn it away. Yeah.
Hi, Steve Karan, Lerman Center. Wondering if you guys could address sort of along the lines of the last question about standards. The 3.7 to 3.8 band is part of band 43 for LTE, and this is really for Jamie and Chris to kind of address how does standards affect whether this is something you're interested in, whether you need an LTE to operate. I know you're not doing that in the 600 megahertz band, but how does that sort of affect your policy direction? Thanks.
Well, I would point out actually I think it's band 41. It's 43. Yeah. And actually it goes from 4.7 down below 3.6, right?
Parts, well, 43 dedicated is 3,700, 3,800, but nobody's allocated above 3,800 anywhere in the globe yet.
Yeah.
So I keep hearing 3,700 to 4,200 is the 5G band. It's fabricated. Yeah. It doesn't exist globally right now.
Of it, yeah.
Exactly.
And the challenge is if you have a band class that serves part of the band, you kind of need to serve all of the band. And so if it spans down, you need to have it.
I mean, it's a very fair point, though, to making this a manufacturable, deployable, operational product quickly. Those of us that are working on CBRS technology are ready to adapt quickly. So, I mean, this is something that I think is near and dear with the FCC, is how fast can we do something, assuming that there's a good spectrum sharing or a good spectrum clearing plan. So we certainly know equipment-wise, the whole industry is kind of rallying towards this part of the band and the RF and et cetera. I mean, the costs can be extraordinarily aggressive as a result of getting the volume in that space.
My general observation is when people spend money, spectrum gets put to use. When people don't spend money, spectrum lies fallow.
Like Wi-Fi?
What? Oh, but no. It's everyone puts money in it. Wi-Fi is heavily invested. Every investor, Intel, Qualcomm, and stuff like that. Yeah. But Wi-Fi, if you remember, was available in the early 90s. Right. It wasn't invested upon because no one spent money.
Okay. Yeah, right here.
So Peter Flynn from Viasat again. So this is a fascinating discussion. And it really boils down to value. And we've mentioned value in a couple of places, which means money. Okay, it boils down to money, okay. And I'm trying to reconcile, because my wonderful colleagues in the satellite industry have floated the number of $15 billion to clear 100 megahertz. And I haven't seen anybody from the cellular industry rush to grab that deal just yet. Okay. Okay, but that number's been floated, and it's set an expectation. Just a second. It's set an expectation. But I haven't seen anybody from the carrier side come in and say, yeah, I got to get me some of that. That they think the value is anywhere close to what the current occupiers of that spectrum are expecting out of that spectrum. So, and the problem that I see is that in that discussion, it's I got to clear the band in order to achieve the value that you want to achieve. Right. And that means that I'm trading off this value for that value. And that value has to be more than this value, otherwise there's no deal, right? Very simple, okay?
Yep.
And what I'm hearing on the unlicensed side is a completely different story. They're now looking to clear the bands. They're not looking to substitute a value for another value. They're looking, the unlicensed band is looking to add value by higher utilization of the band without interfering with the existing value.
So first of all, let's not call it unlicensed, please, because it will not be unlicensed.
Okay, fair. Shared use, shared
Yes.
use. Okay, fair. Thank you, shared use. And so I'm trying to understand, there's a fundamental difference in the economic story that's being told here between it's either he wins or he wins versus it's shared use and we keep the value we have. And why is that not the fundamental question here?
That's a fair point, Jamie. Do you
Yeah, I
want-
mean, I'll take a stab at it. I mean, that was why we put the petition in the first place, because we did a study. Actually, we partnered together with Google and did a lot of work on trying to look at the ground. We talked to the AP, tried to find out, how much spectrum do you use when you're sending a radio channel? Like, well, okay, this dish is only running on 23 megahertz. Okay, that's underutilized. The sky is very full. The transponders are, but there's opportunity. So we believed that that was going to be a situation where spectrum sharing was probably more of an imperative, because spectrum clearing is not an option here across the whole band, and I think we know it. So is a portion good enough? And I asked the same question, because I think Verizon's obviously spending a ton of time on millimeter wave. I don't really know where they sit on this topic. AT&T has stayed suspiciously quiet. And then now we have 2.5 gig EBS licenses coming to market as well since all of this came out. So a lot has changed in the last year. But that's why we filed this originally this way, was we felt that spectrum sharing, and I think Rachel Bender put it really well the other day. It's like, gone are the days that spectrum clearing can be done easily, and now we're in a world of spectrum sharing. So I do want to spend the time to get this technologically right, and I do want to spend the time to make sure that we don't waste or ruin opportunities that they need, for the day before the Super Bowl. There are tools that do that, and we don't want to put an undue burden, but this was also free spectrum given to the satellite industry. I think it's incumbent on them, as the incumbent, to at least let everybody know exactly what's being utilized and coming up with a system to do that. It's very difficult to argue with that, and I think that that's where the FCC is likely going to, and they're committed to doing the database, getting a look at what is out there. Because if we don't categorize that, then how am I supposed to trust what the real value is of what needs to be cleared or what is underutilized?
Yeah, that's a point I think goes all the way back to the beginning of Andy's proposal, where he showed the reason we're talking about clearing for mobile, at least in the bottom of the band, is because it would be extremely challenging for mobile to share there's vacant capacity across the entire C-band, but for mobile to share that with fixed satellite, very challenging. Maybe at some point it can be done in certain places, but it wouldn't be ubiquitous coverage. It would have to be here, here, and here, and here. Whereas fixed wireless, because it's sectorized, it can point, directional antennas can squeeze in between. And so the analogy is very much to the same way that everybody, the mobile carriers and everybody else, plans to use Citizens Band, the band below, CBRS, by working around the Navy. The Navy doesn't change what it does. It's very concerned, of course, and still hasn't necessarily signed off on everything. But ultimately, they don't change what they do. You work around them and use the empty capacity, and that's the thrust of the fixed wireless proposal here.
You just have to be very clear that there's these earth stations are very sensitive to interference. And it's a bit like a vegetable garden. Some things pair well together in the garden. Other things, you can't put the potatoes next to the cucumbers or whatever it might be. So you have to be really careful of what you plant next to each other in the garden.
Right,
so,
but at the same time, I mean, even the ITU agrees. Like basically, you can't put anything in today's rule. You get 500 megahertz, full band, full arc, and you have to be about at least 70 kilometers away. Like that is, that's for co-channel operation. It's still pretty aggressive in my opinion, but especially for unused channels, the ITU studies are say we can get way, way closer, several kilometers. And obviously we have to respect the receiver figure on these, and we don't dispute that at all. But that's what we need to work together on, because I just don't think there's any other way to get through this.
the cause wants to.
I think it's too simplistic. I mean, I appreciate where our fixed wireless guys are coming from, but I can't overemphasize the sensitivity of satellite signals, and there are proven cases that have happened. I can give you a picture now that the World Cup is going on. There was a case in Bolivia back in the World Cup in 2006, I believe, where they allocated the adjacent band to WiMAX, and they blasted the whole country while watching a soccer game, and everybody went berserk. So interference, it's too simplistic. The thinking, oh, we'll just work around you. The premise of satellite services does not afford, I mean, you have a pristine service, like I was talking, 5 nines that people have come to rely upon. And then to try to play with it and try to pollute the spectrum with another type of service right now, while we are talking about 5G, I think to be completely misguided. I mean, here we have a pristine service that is being provided. We are trying, as the current users who have been using it for 50 years, we're trying to make way for other services, and then we are flexible. We understand the speed that the mobile side or the 5G operators want. But at the same time, we have a set of constituents that we need to protect. And they are key constituents. They are broadcasters, they are people that we rely upon. And that's what I would like to say.
I think Andy may want to.
And I agree with Oz, it needs to be protected, but I would point out that they're already existing immediately adjacent to one band that's used for point-to-multipoint, 50-watt plus fixed services. You're already operating immediately adjacent to that service on one side. But even more amazingly, immediately adjacent on the next side are airplanes that point radars down to measure the distance to the ground, flying directly through your satellite beams, and you. But the point is you're saying that you have 5 nines reliability. You're able to do that in the presence of this aircraft interference, and you're doing it by filtering. It's exactly the same situation that we would say if we were going to do adjacent channel point to multipoint. It's filtering. So you either can or you can't operate in the presence of adjacent band interference, and apparently you can.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously, as representing small cable operators who are actually the users, whereas these two are talking about how their proposals will impact us. From our perspective, channel sharing may be theoretically costless, but in reality, it's unlikely to be. And the problem with it is there is no means currently to get reimbursed for those costs. I mean, and that's a problem with the proposal. And I think that with the satellite proposal, the question really is how much money will be raised and what costs will be reimbursed. And there's been a lack of detail on those points. I mean, for smaller operators who don't have fiber backhaul available to them already, would require a 10 to 15 mile fiber to be deployed to them, which can cost $1 million. And these small systems may serve a few hundred subscribers. The cable operator themselves cannot afford to pay for that. That money will have to, if this plan is going to discontinue service or in some ways impact it, those costs have to be recouped somewhere. And it would be helpful to see some details on exactly what would be reimbursed and what wouldn't be.
Sounds like an incentive auction to me.
We only have a couple more minutes, but if these two here could just one after the other, and then we'll do a quick response, no speeches, and then we'll be done.
Hi, Nicholas Dale. I'm an industry analyst. And I think we've darted around the question, but what does 5G mean for each of your constituent communities and end users?
So 3 really quick things. One, I want to thank Michelle for the phrase a traditional incentive auction. That incentive auctions have now reached that status of being old and established. I will point out we did lose signal in the middle of a Super Bowl game, and despite the state of the world today, I don't think we can blame it on the fact that we lost a live stream Super Bowl, even a Super Bowl, the most watched content out there. But to the question about the value proposition, if this spectrum was worth, and I'm just taking this number because the math works easy, 30 cents a megahertz pop, which is far less than any of the current commercial bands are worth, 100 megahertz would be worth $10 billion. 500 megahertz would be worth $50 billion. That's the kind of money that is at play here and the value created from being able to reallocate this. It's not a comment on what the costs to reallocation are going to be. It's just to say there's quite a lot of value here created.
Okay, so any rapid-fire responses to those?
I just wanted to
Yeah,
note,
Michelle?
with respect to what Ross said before, definitely the consortium would reimburse all costs for the users, but it kind of depends. Everybody has to say what their costs would be, and we haven't seen the cost yet, so. But that would be reimbursed.
And who would be able to participate on the consortium? Because I think there's been a little lack of clarity over who would be a member of it, and would there be user representation on that consortium in determining what is going to be reimbursable?
Understood. Okay.
And if carriers are paying $10 billion, you know, hopefully there's enough for costs.
But I appreciate the sentiment.
No,
and
clear on that.
So let me
care about our customers.
Yes.
Any final points here on the panel? And then
yeah, I mean, I want to touch on the cost question as well. I mean, if you actually look at the numbers when it comes down to mobile, you know, how much does it cost per gigabyte as a consumer, and versus what you pay on broadband, still there is today a 50x to 100x more cost that you pay to the mobile side. So it's not to bash mobile. What it's to say is that I cannot participate in the fixed wireless side in rural areas and places that are, you can't afford fiber. It can't afford those kind of dollars per megahertz per pop. So, you know, this is where we look at this and go, all right, we have to look at this as some form of infrastructure that's opportunistic, especially if it's in areas that we want to avoid fallowing out in traditional mechanisms. And obviously, nobody wants to wait for secondary, you know, transactions here. That's what it's going to take if we want to think about rural America getting solved. We can't think about it in dollars per megahertz per pop. In cities, yeah, absolutely. That's what it's going to be. But that's, you know, when we get out to rural, it's a very different situation. When we talk about broadband, it's a very different situation.
Yeah, and actually an event we had earlier this year was, the title was Spectrum as Infrastructure for Rural Broadband, thinking that, you know, so it's a public resource, and how we allocate it is a values question in terms of, are we going to get these broadband services out to everyone in the country or not? Can't always be, particularly when you talk about a public resource, can't always be just based on what might be most profitable in particular places. All right, well, we're a little bit over time, but this was fascinating background for this whole debate, which will be going on and on this year. Thank you. Thank you all.